I think this is a great question, and this is something that a lot of people struggle with. So I'm going to use an analogy to maybe help explain where the disconnect for a lot of folks is, and how and what they do with their horse from the ground creates, I'm going to say, a lostness in the human where they're unsure of how to help the horse through scenarios such as at feeding time when the horse is anticipative, there's chaos, maybe he's feeding off of other horses' energy, a bunch of other things might be going on, and it can very quickly and easily overwhelm the human, especially if they have to go like into the pasture and the horse winds up coming at them or pushing on them or coming into their space, whatever it might be. So think of if you've ever tried to learn a new language. I find a lot of folks want to not go through the bits and pieces of learning, individual words and learning how to piece together simple sentences, especially folks who are traveling where they go, I'm not going to be fluent in this language. I just need a few, like catchphrases that I'm going to use when I travel and so on. And so they start memorizing phrases in the foreign language. And so as they travel, if a scenario arises that works, they then have, I'm going to say, a language, a sentence or a whatever in that language to use. The problem is, if it's a scenario that is different than what they've practiced for, they obviously are going to have missing words. They're not going to be able to communicate. And this is what I find happens with people and their horses, especially in groundwork, when people want to watch something typically online or in person or at a clinic, and then they want to go home and they want to practice the outcome or the final version of whatever it is that they think they're seeing without even realizing how much they don't recognize that they're not seeing that may be going on, which happens a lot with professionals. So when they're mimicking what they've seen, they don't have, I'm going to say, the individual words to make, I'm going to say, adaptable sentences for whatever the scenario is with their horse, if that makes sense. So in terms of thinking about feeding time, most people would say, well, that horse needs to give you lots of personal space and move out of your way. And so people are focused on, how do I, move the horse far enough away so that I feel safe or I feel okay as I'm walking in with grain or buckets or feed or whatever it might be that you're doing. What they're not recognizing is the first question and assessment to then help them recognize where maybe holes in their or their horse's education is how does my horse respond to spatial pressure? Because if we don't recognize that when we go to walk into the pasture and our hands are full and we're not physically touching the horse, we're going to be communicating with spatial pressure, and we've never assessed if there is any value to our communication, if we have intention spatially in how we project, I'm going to say, our energy, if we have the ability from afar to direct the horse's thought to look and think away from us and then ask them to move off, versus the typical just get big and dramatic and maybe the horse will move away or back up or get out of your space, but as soon as you turn your attention to something else, the horse comes right in on top of you. We don't recognize that we haven't, before the feeding session, practiced refining the tools of being able to communicate in a way that has value to the horse. Then at feeding time, it feels like there's this vicious cycle of the horse constantly coming in and posing, we're constantly getting bigger and dramatic. And in fact, the more over and over that we get big and dramatic, the more that the horse is going to escalate the degree in which he's pushing in on us, maybe spatially, maybe eventually physically, maybe touching us, and potentially putting us in a dangerous spot, especially if there's other horses around where they're all bouncing off of each other and not really paying attention to the human. So every time you have a scenario, whether it's feed time or any other time, instead of going, here is the outcome I want you to instead say, what are the tools in my communication that I would need to have to literally communicate with the horse in order to reach that outcome? And then assess the quality of those tools. And if there are parts where you use bigger energy and the horse completely shuts down and doesn't move, if you use bigger energy and the horse becomes defensive, this tells you where you need to slow down and address things, not at peak stress or anticipative moments, but on calm, quiet days where you can practice refining your skills and you can basically practice the conversation, the clarity of the communication, so that it has value to the horse, so that the day that you are walking in with food or he is triggered by something, the way in which you're communicating has value to him. Now, again, for most people, they want to go do, I'm going to say, quote, the fun stuff to the human, not the horse. And they don't really want to work on refining the tools, refining the communication. But what they're not recognizing is the same communication you would need to direct the horse's thought and his energy and his movement away from you at feed time is no different than if he were on the line and you were asking him to load in the trailer, than if you were walking up towards the mounting block, than if you were ponying a horse off of him, than if you were out on the trail and going over different terrain where he'd need to think and adapt where his body is. It is all the same conversation. And this is the biggest, I'm going to say, disservice in the generalized step 1, 2, 3 method of teaching, I'm going to say, groundwork exercises that I find that literally drive horses nuts and create defensive anticipative train wrecks of horses, is that people are missing the understanding that it isn't about the scenario. It's about learning how to communicate, and then you take those communication skills and they're adaptable for whatever the scenario might be.